La siguiente ponencia es Desastres y fronteras. ¿Son las fronteras importantes, intrascendentes o ambas? Con la doctora Kathleen Tierney de la Universidad de Colorado en Boulder. Adelante, doctora. El doctor Guzmán nos hará favor de presentar a la ponente.
La doctora Kathleen Tierney es directora emérita del Instituto de Ciencias de Ciencias de Comportamiento en la Universidad de Colorado en Boulder. Fue directora también del Centro de Peligros Naturales a partir del año 2003 y hasta 2016. Durante su carrera profesional estudió un amplio espectro de desastres, terremotos, huracanes, desastres tecnológicos y los ataques terroristas a Nueva York del 11 de septiembre del 2001. Sus publicaciones cubren también una gama de tópicos, desde la percepción al riesgo, alertas ante un desastre y respuestas de las organizaciones, vulnerabilidad social ante un desastre y la política económica asociada a estos desastres. La doctora Tierney ha sido miembro del Comité de las Academias Nacionales de los Estados Unidos para la investigación de las ciencias sociales sobre desastres, así como en el panel sobre estrategias y métodos para las decisiones y acciones relacionadas con el cambio climático. Hoy en día es integrante del Comité de las Academias Nacionales para asesorar el programa de investigación de los Estados Unidos sobre cambio climático. La doctora Tierney cuenta con una serie de reconocimientos otorgados por sus contribuciones en artículos científicos, autoría y coautoría de varios libros, así como su labor editorial y su participación en diversas sociedades profesionales. Doctora, adelante, por favor.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Before I start my presentation, I want to express my appreciation to the organizers of this symposium for inviting me to take part, particularly because I'm not an engineer. I'm a sociologist by training, but I've had the pleasure of working with many engineers over the course of my career, including the speaker who came right before me, Professor O'Rourke. He's a very difficult act to follow. So I thought that my presentation here was going to be quite a bit different from other presentations that you would hear today, but I find that it isn't. And in fact, the first two presentations pointed to some of the issues that I'm going to be talking about with you this morning, which has to do with institutional infrastructures rather than physical infrastructures. And I think we've already heard that institutions are incredibly important, whether we're talking about transportation systems, water systems, other systems. I also want to express my deepest and most heartfelt sympathy for all of those affected by the terrible earthquake disasters that have occurred just in the last couple of weeks. This symposium is about disasters and borders, but the first part of my presentation this morning is going to talk about how borders are becoming increasingly irrelevant when we consider hazards, disasters, and their management. And I'm going to start by talking with you about the concept of trans-system or trans-border crises, transboundary crises. I'm going to then move on to discuss the challenges associated with managing transboundary disruptions, and also then talk about a little bit about U.S.-Mexico activities around transboundary threats. So disasters, as we know, are no respecters of borders. And regarding U.S.-Mexico relations in the context of disasters, the Committee on Disaster Research of the National Academy of Sciences was involved in cross-border research between our two countries as early as the 1950s, One committee report focused on household, community, and organizational responses to the Rio Grande flooding that occurred in 1954, comparing Eagle Pass, Texas, and Piedras Negras, Mexico. That report, which was almost 200 pages long, looked at the economic, the social, the familial interdependencies between the two communities, the family ties that existed, the cultural dimensions of the responses to the flooding on both sides of the border. And among the recommendations that came out of that report were that an agency be established for coordination and cooperation between the U.S. and Mexico on issues of flooding, and that new norms be developed to help the two countries' joint efforts in future disaster events. That was in 1956. So I want to flash forward now to more recent times when transborder disasters have attracted increasing attention. Just to give you a few examples of transborder crises that have happened in the last 20 years, in 1997, the Red River of the North experienced massive flooding that caused major impacts in the US and in Canada. In Europe, in 2000, a break occurred in a dam that was holding toxic waste at a gold mine in Baia Mare, Romania, which sent large amounts of cyanide into the Somes River and then into the Tisza River, the second largest river in Hungary, and onward into the Danube, affecting Serbia and Bulgaria. The spill poisoned drinking water for millions of people in these countries in Europe and resulted in massive fish kills and environmental degradation. In early 2003, an outbreak of severe acute respiratory syndrome, or SARS, developed in the Pearl River Valley of China, in the People's Republic of China, and ultimately spread to 37 countries with major impacts in locations as far away as Hong Kong and Toronto, Canada. In August of that year, the electrical power grid in parts, the electrical power grid in parts of the eastern, midwestern United States and the province of Ontario in Canada failed, leaving major cities such as New York City and Toronto completely without power for days. In 2004, we had the Great Indian Ocean earthquake and tsunami, which killed people in 14 countries. Then in 2008, the global financial system crashed. That originated in the United States and almost collapsed the entire economic system, worldwide economic system. More recently, earthquakes in Taiwan, floods in Thailand, the 2011 Japan triple disaster caused major disruptions in global supply chains, affecting trade in such important products as semiconductors, hard drives, auto parts, and causing substantial losses to iconic companies like Honda, Toyota, Nissan, Samsung, Western Digital, Seagate, and Lenovo. An organization called ResilInc, which keeps track of supply chain disruptions, reported that the 5 most expensive supply chain disruptions that occurred in 2016 were all caused by disasters, specifically earthquakes in Taiwan and Japan, and 3 typhoons that affected Taiwan, China, and the Philippines. And just in the last month, of course, we've once again been reminded that disasters span borders and have international impacts. The magnitude 8.1 earthquake that struck offshore Chiapas also affected Guatemala. Hurricane Irma Hurricane Irma cut a swath through the Caribbean and the United States, affecting island nations and territories within the jurisdictions of the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and the Netherlands, along with the nations of Cuba, the Dominican Republic, and Haiti, as well as the United States itself. And then after that, along came Hurricane Maria that damaged some of those same places and other ones as well. And of course, there's an ongoing risk worldwide of attacks to the cyber infrastructure and to systems that are dependent on that infrastructure. Any sort of cyber crisis would cross borders, would spread very rapidly, and would cause massive disruption and losses. These are all examples of what social scientists who study these kinds of events call trans-system or transboundary crises. According to researchers who look into these kinds of transborder disruptions, these events have several characteristics. One characteristic, obviously, is that they span borders. That's obvious. Another characteristic is that they often start small, with small disruptions and failures, but then they unexpectedly become much larger. For example, the 2003 failure of the electrical power grid in the US and Canada started out with a couple of little accidents that spread and that eventually disrupted subway and air travel, shut down water systems, disrupted communications and cell phone service, degraded the emergency response system, and caused widespread health problems in the areas that were affected, including 90 additional deaths in New York City alone that could be attributed to the power failure. Another characteristic of these transboundary disasters is that as they unfold, officials in the countries affected or potentially affected have great difficulty in getting a full picture of what is actually happening, in part because of the uncertainties associated with such crises, but also because those officials may have never interacted with one another before in the context of a crisis. So the situation is uncertain, and the participants in attempting to manage the situation are unfamiliar with one another. Additionally, there can be legal barriers or political barriers to sharing information across borders, or nations may outright deny or cover up the fact that there is a major transborder threat that is unfolding, as happened in 1986 with the Chernobyl nuclear disaster and in 2003 with SARS. So there are barriers and often refusal to share information on these crises. Large-scale disasters that affect individual societies, we know, are very difficult to manage. But when multiple societies are affected, communication and coordination problems in these kinds of events increase exponentially. Further, it may only be after a transborder event has occurred that pre-existing vulnerabilities are exposed. These are vulnerabilities that the authorities and other actors involved never recognized to begin with. For example, after the 2011 triple disaster in Japan, that was when Toyota realized that its worldwide business was disrupted because the suppliers of materials that were necessary for making its vehicles were concentrated in the impact area. And finally, these kinds of disruptions have the potential for creating legitimacy crises for the governments that are involved. We saw this, for example, with the SARS outbreak in the People's Republic of China, where the credibility and the crisis management capability of the Chinese government was so widely questioned that the Chinese leadership was essentially forced to revamp the country's entire emergency management system. SARS was a tremendous crisis of legitimacy for a ruling government that is always worried about its legitimacy and always concerned about civil unrest and disruption. So the potential for creating legitimacy crises is great, particularly with respect to these trans-border types of events, where you see, for example, one country handling a disaster well and another handling it poorly. Now, disasters that affect multiple nations and systems are, of course, not new. They've always been happening. The Lisbon earthquake of 1755 was felt all over Europe. It was felt in northern Africa. The tsunamis that it created had impacts in England and in Ireland. This was an event that, as most of you know, had very wide-ranging social, economic, and cultural effects. For example, that earthquake struck a blow to Portugal's imperial ambitions, and it led to major rethinking of the causes of earthquakes, going from more religious frameworks for looking at earthquakes to more secular ones. However, even though trans-border disasters aren't new, what is new is that now we're beginning to understand the specific challenges that our societies face in the specific 21st century social and economic context. With respect to that, I think that context has two key characteristics. First of all, we live in an increasingly globalized and interconnected world. And second, we lack the transnational governance structures, the transnational institutions to manage the risks associated with transboundary disasters. Globalization means that societies and economies are more interconnected and more interdependent than ever before, and frequently in ways that are not well understood, as we see in the example of global supply chains that are disrupted by very distant disaster events. Our complex and interconnected system of transportation means that outbreaks like SARS can spread very, very rapidly, even before officials in the affected countries even know about them. In a globalized world, corporations have to be very, very large to compete on a global landscape. And size of a corporation is usually considered a strength with respect to disaster management, because large size enterprises have large resources with which to deal with and manage risk. But size isn't always an advantage, particularly when large global entities fail to understand the risks that are associated with particular places around the world where they're doing business. So they may lack an understanding of the vulnerabilities. They also may not care all that much about hazards and risks in different places where they're doing business. For example, having experienced a series of major disasters in its US plants, BP talked a lot about improving its safety culture to prevent incidents like a massive explosion at a plant, multi-fatality explosion at a plant that had occurred in Texas City, Texas. BP talked a lot about improving its safety culture, but it invested nothing in improving its safety culture right up until the time of the massive Deepwater Horizon blowout and the BP oil spill. And global integration can also mean that risky practices and even criminal practices diffuse through those global networks, as happened, for example, prior to the 2008 financial meltdown. Risky practices permeated the global financial system. Equally important, though, is the fact that governance mechanisms for managing transboundary disruptions are either deficient or lacking entirely. Hazards cross borders, but quite often the ability to manage them does not cross borders. In his book, Disasters Without Borders, the sociologist John Hannigan describes a constellation of global disaster risk reduction organizations, policies, and practices, not as a system or even as a network, but rather as a diffuse, segmented, and potentially conflicted policy field that consists of a number of actors with varying roles, responsibilities, and authorities. So Hannigan says if you look at how hazards and disasters are managed worldwide, you come up with a whole constellation of entities that are involved in one way or another. You have, of course, nation states. You have regional organizations such as the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, the Organization of American States, OES, the Caribbean Community, CARICOM. You have international financial institutions such as the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, the Asian Development Bank, the International Finance Corporation, and the North American Development Bank, which we heard about in the first presentation this morning. Then you have a variety of multi-actor initiatives, partnerships of a public-private nature, such as the Prevention Consortium, and in the area of climate change, the Belmont Forum. You have the United Nations, you have various UN agreements and accords, such as UNDRO, the United Nations Disaster Relief Program, the International Strategy for Disaster Reduction, the ISDR. You have non-governmental organizations, NGOs, that operate internationally. You have scientific and technical communities, such as academies of sciences and academies of engineering, and organizations like the Earthquake Engineering Research Institute, which span borders. You have private sector actors such as the insurance and reinsurance industries, the risk modeling industries, and you have the global media that plays a major role in influencing what issues related to hazards and disasters and which disasters and where get attention. So while some of these groups work together well, some of the time there are tensions both within and among these 9 groups of policy actors, and the governance arrangements are very vague in terms of them working together. Nation states vary enormously in their capabilities, their legal frameworks for governing hazards and disasters, the priority that they place on disaster-related issues, and their willingness to collaborate with other nations in the area of disaster risk reduction. Global institutions such as the World Bank and the IMF have tremendous influence over many nation states, and they've implemented many disaster risk reduction programs. But their other activities, such as their structural adjustment programs, may actually have the effect of increasing disaster vulnerability. So they help on the one hand, but they can hurt on the other hand. United Nations programs have had mixed effects at best. non-governmental organizations that usually operate after disaster strike in the relief and recovery phase, but their activities are often very uncoordinated, and sometimes they even put disaster-stricken areas, the people in those areas, at greater risk. Because, for example, in building temporary housing after an earthquake, they may put it in a floodplain, as they did in Haiti. So, as Hannigan also points out in his book, Disasters Without Borders, these different players in the global disaster risk reduction policy arena even differ in how they conceptualize hazards and disasters. Issues, for example, of disaster risk reduction on the one hand, or maybe humanitarian aid, or maybe international development, or maybe global environmental change and climate change. Additionally, transboundary risks and disasters may be conceptualized as issues of national security. So there is not only no common governance framework, there's not even a common conceptual framework that would enable these 9 sets of actors to work together more closely. Legal scholars have been conducting research on what they refer to as transnational legal ordering. Transnational legal ordering is the development of legal norms, standards, practices, and institutions that cross national boundaries. Measures that are needed in a world in which pressing problems of concern are affecting multiple states, multiple nation states, multiple regions. Examples of some transnational legal orders include various legal arrangements in business, of course, in human rights law, in conventions related to problems such as human trafficking. Legal scholars have also noted, though, that transnational legal orders have not yet emerged in the disaster area, with the possible exception of nuclear disasters, where there are treaties that were advanced and adopted through the International Atomic Energy Agency. Legal analysts have sort of scratched their heads and said, hazards and disasters are an area where you would expect to see transnational legal ordering taking place because of the nature of disasters, their transboundary nature, their tendency to affect multiple nations. And scholars have concluded that it's probably the case that the motivation to work on developing transnational legal orders within this arena does not seem to be there. So there isn't a political will to work on transnational legal ordering as there has been with respect to some other problems. So I'd like to turn next, just briefly, to a discussion of where the US and Mexico are with respect to cross-border hazard and disaster management, governance arrangements, and what organizations and institutions are involved. Our two countries share a border that's 1,952 miles long. There are only 9 borders in the world that are longer than that, and one of them is the border between US and Canada. And just to start off with kind of a broad overarching context, it goes without saying that cross-border cooperation and collaboration anywhere in the world on any set of issues are dependent on the nature of the relationships that exist among the nations that are trying to collaborate. And of course, with respect to the US and Mexico and their transborder relationship, there's a huge elephant in the room, or maybe I should say a huge, beautiful elephant in the room, that I won't discuss here, but that we're all aware of. It's not always been this way, and it won't always be this way. But for the time being, it seems that issues of immigration and drug control have taken center stage at the expense of many other important issues, such as disaster risk reduction. Assessments of trans-border relationships between the U.S. and Mexico, it looks like leave a lot to be desired. And again, these collaborations with respect to hazards and disasters take place within a broader overall framework of international relations. The Binational Task Force on the U.S.-Mexico border produced a report a few years ago that said cooperation across the border remains spotty and imperfect, and we've heard already in the first presentation this morning some of the reasons why. Many of these efforts remain unsystematic and ad hoc. They're not guided by any broader vision of how the shared boundary should be managed. That's a pretty harsh assessment. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development had a bit more of a positive assessment when it did its report on Mexico. It said, while international agreements and joint cooperation mechanisms related to risk management have been established between Mexico and the United States, both at federal and local levels, cross-border cooperation has not been developed to its full potential. It's very diplomatic. So when we look at disaster risk reduction, we see that there are collaborations that are taking place. There was an agreement in 2008 on emergency management cooperation, a treaty, but the treaty only set up a working group to work on those issues, and that work is still ongoing. The best developed areas of cross-border collaboration that touch upon hazards and disasters involve water resources, the International Boundary and Water Commission for the Colorado River, the Rio Grande, and the Rio Bravo. And interestingly, chemical hazards and the environment, and this goes back more than 30 years to the 1983 La Paz Agreement, and more recently to the Joint Contingency Plan, which involves the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency and environmental agencies in Mexico, focusing on things like toxic contamination, toxic releases. There is also planning going on in the area of pandemics. But there seems to be, at least in my reading, limited collaboration on risk reduction for cross-border hazards such as hurricanes, earthquakes, and floods, and even on providing assistance in disasters, where Hurricane Katrina in 2005 was the first time that the United States accepted aid from Mexico. So limited even in terms of response. But what we do see, and what we can talk about more if you want to provide some examples, are scientific and technical collaboration. So the players in the scientific arena do collaborate. Some examples have to do with flood risk assessment in the Ambas Nogales watershed, where people on the US side and people on the Mexico side are looking at flood hazards, as well as something that Tom referred to earlier with the Imperial Fault, where engineers and scientists on both sides of the border have worked on a scenario to begin to look at what the vulnerabilities, what the impacts, and what the responses will be in the case of those that particular fault and that particular border region. And I hope that you'll be able to provide some other examples of collaboration that you know of. So with that, I will stop and say thank you from my university, the University of Colorado Boulder, in beautiful Boulder, Colorado, in the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. Thank you very much.